In the biting, wind-scoured winter of early 1943, the jagged ridgelines of the Tunisian Atlas Mountains played host to a surreal and dangerous cultural collision that would determine the fate of the Western Alliance. As the soldiers of the United States Army's Second Corps, fresh from their relatively bloodless victories against the Vichy French during Operation Torch, settled into their positions with the swagger of tourists on a heavily armed safari rather than men standing on the precipice of annihilation. To the casual observer, the American military machine looked impressive, a rolling industrial marvel of endless supply columns, brand-new deuce-and-a-half trucks, and pristine uniforms that earned the troops the derisive nickname the Green Hornets from their British allies. But beneath the veneer of logistical abundance lay a rotting core of tactical naivety and dangerous overconfidence. The average American GI in Tunisia treated the war as a temporary inconvenience, a job to be finished quickly so he could return to the comforts of home, a mindset encouraged by a logistics system that prioritized the delivery of Coca-Cola, cigarettes, and mail over the grim necessities of combat discipline, creating a rear area atmosphere that felt more like a chaotic Boy Scout jamboree than a forward operating base. Men wandered the front lines without helmets, dug shallow slit trenches instead of proper fighting positions because the ground was too hard and the officers were too lenient, and drove their jeeps with headlights blazing at night, oblivious to the fact that they were being watched by the most predatory eyes in the history of modern warfare. Across the arid valley, concealed in the shadows of the eastern dorsal, sat the veterans of the Deutsche Afrika Corps, men whose skin had been tanned to the color of old leather by years of desert warfare, and whose tactical instincts had been honed by the brutal seesaw battles against the British Eighth Army. To Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, the legendary Desert Fox, and his austere subordinate General Hans-Jürgen von Arnim, the American arrival was a source of professional amusement rather than concern, for they observed a disorganized mob that broadcast its intentions in the clear over unencrypted radios, discussing patrol routes and supply dumps with a terrifying lack of operational security that allowed German intelligence officers to map the U.S. positions with greater accuracy than the American commanders themselves. Rommel, peering through his binoculars from his mobile headquarters, noted with disdain that the Americans had committed the cardinal sin of armored warfare. They had fragmented their strength. Instead of concentrating their tanks and artillery into a single devastating fist, the U.S. command had scattered their units in penny packets across hundreds of miles of frontage, isolating battalions on lonely hilltops known locally as jebels, where they could be surrounded and destroyed one by one without hope of mutual support. This tactical malpractice was not the fault of the soldiers, but the direct result of a catastrophic failure of leadership at the very top, personified by Major General Lloyd Frendendahl, a man who would soon become synonymous with military incompetence. Frendendahl, a prickly and abrasive officer who detested his British superiors and distrusted his own subordinates, commanded the Corps not from the front, but from a deep subterranean bunker complex nearly 100 miles behind the lines near Tebessa, a place he had obsessively engineered with air conditioning and concrete reinforcements while his men shivered in the mud. Isolated in his Speedy Valley headquarters, Frendendahl issued orders based on maps that bore no relation to the rugged reality of the terrain, communicating via a bizarre personal code of slang that confused his field commanders and delayed critical movements. He insisted on positioning his infantry on the high ground and his armor in the rear, creating a static defensive posture that ceded the initiative entirely to the Germans, effectively trapping his own army in a series of disconnected islands. The veteran panzer crews of the 10th and 21st Panzer Divisions, riding in their battle-scarred Panzer III and IV tanks and supported by the terrifying Tiger I heavy panzer tanks of the 501st Heavy Panzer Battalion, spent the early days of February conducting reconnaissance probes that were essentially dress rehearsals for a massacre, driving right up to the American lines to gauge the reaction time of the defenders. What they found was a lethargic, confused enemy that took hours to call for artillery support and whose tanks rushed blindly into ambushes, their crews displaying a reckless bravery that was no match for German gunnery. The sentiment in the German mess tents was one of derision. They joked that the Americans were Italians with better equipment, a soft enemy that would crumble at the first sign of real pressure. This hubris, however, was dangerous for both sides. For the Germans, it risked underestimating the American capacity for learning, but for the Americans, it meant that the lesson, when it came, would have to be written in blood. By Valentine's Day of 1943, the trap was set, the panzers were fueled, and the Desert Fox was ready to teach the amateurs a lesson in the art of war, unaware that the coming disaster would be the crucible necessary to burn away the softness of the American army and forge the steel that would eventually crush the Third Reich. But first, the innocents abroad had to pay the tuition of the battlefield, a price that would be exacted in the burning sands of Sidi Bouzid and the humiliating retreat that followed.
The deceptive tranquility of the Tunisian dawn on February 14, 1943, was shattered not by the romantic gestures of St. Valentine's Day, but by the roar of the spring breeze, the code name for the German offensive Operation Frühlingswind, which descended upon the unsuspecting Americans with the fury of a desert sandstorm made of steel and high explosives. At Sidi Bouzid, a dusty crossroads village surrounded by the imposing rocky outcrops of Jebel Lasouda and Jebel Ksaira, the soldiers of the U.S. 1st Armored Division's Combat Command A were waking up to a howling gale that whipped sand into their eyes and clogged their weapons, a meteorological screen that the veteran German commanders used to mask the movement of 2 entire panzer divisions. The American disposition was a textbook example of the penny packet failure dictated by General Fredendall's remote leadership. The 168th Regimental Combat Team was marooned on the high ground of the Jebels, isolated and immobile, while the armor was scattered in small, unsupportive clusters on the valley floor, stripping the tanks of their massed shock power and turning them into sitting ducks. Suddenly, out of the swirling dust and the blinding morning sun, the 10th Panzer Division erupted from the Fayed Pass in the north, while the 21st Panzer Division swept up from the south in a classic Kesselschlacht or cauldron battle pincer movement, a maneuver practiced to perfection on the Russian front, but alien to the inexperienced Americans. The American tanks, mostly lighter M3 Stuarts and early M4 Shermans, scrambled to respond, but they were driving blindly into a kill zone that had been pre-registered by German artillery. The disparity in tactical proficiency was immediately and horrifically apparent as the German Tiger I tanks, invincible monstrosities that could kill from 2 kilometers away, parked comfortably out of range of the American 75mm guns and began to pick off the Shermans one by one, their 88mm shells tearing through the American armor as if it were cardboard. The U.S. commanders, paralyzed by the speed of the German advance and lacking a coherent defensive plan, fed their units into the battle piecemeal, sending a company here and a platoon there to plug the gaps, effectively feeding the fire with teaspoons of fuel rather than dousing it. By the afternoon, the American defense had disintegrated into chaos. The infantry on the hills watched in helpless terror as their armored support was annihilated below, leaving them cut off and surrounded by a sea of German iron. But the true depth of the American incompetence was revealed the following day, February 15th, in an event that would go down in history as a reckless charge of the Light Brigade, driven by pride rather than logic. Under orders to counterattack and rescue the trapped infantry, Lieutenant Colonel James D. Alger's 2nd Battalion, 1st Armored Regiment, launched an assault across the flat, featureless plain toward Sidi Bouzid. It was a move of suicidal bravery, executed with zero tactical imagination. The American tank formation, lined up as if on parade, charged straight into the setting sun, their silhouettes perfectly backlit for the German gunners waiting in the shadows of the olive groves. The Germans, hidden in a U-shaped ambush known as a fire sack, held their fire until the Americans were completely inside the trap, and then unleashed a converging storm of anti-tank fire from 3 sides. The result was absolute slaughter. In less than an hour, fierce explosions ripped the turrets off the American tanks, turning the battalion into a graveyard of burning metal. Of the 52 tanks that began the charge, only 6 survived, and Colonel Alger himself was captured. The battlefield was littered with the burning husks of American industrial might, sending plumes of oily black smoke into the sky that served as a grim signal to the rest of the Corps that the battle was lost. From his command vehicle, Field Marshal Rommel watched the destruction with a mixture of satisfaction and professional disdain, noting in his diary that the Americans had fought with the clumsy enthusiasm of amateurs, seemingly unaware that modern warfare required more than just driving forward and pulling a trigger. He observed that they lacked the instinct for the terrain, failing to use hull-down positions or coordinate their artillery with their armor, treating the deadly serious business of tank warfare like a cowboy charge in a Western movie. The defeat at Sidi Bouzid was total. 2 tank battalions had been erased from the order of battle, thousands of men were dead, wounded, or missing, and the morale of the Second Corps had been shattered. As the survivors streamed back toward the west in a disorganized panic, abandoning jeeps, artillery pieces, and supplies to the enemy, the illusion of American superiority vanished, replaced by the terrifying realization that they were fighting a varsity team while still learning the rules of the game. The road to the Kasserine Pass was now wide open, and the Germans, emboldened by the ease of their victory and laden with captured American rations and gasoline, pressed the accelerator, determined to turn a tactical defeat into a strategic catastrophe that would drive the Allies into the sea, proving that in the school of blood, the tuition for failure is paid instantly and without mercy.
By February 19, 1943, the shattered remnants of the American Second Corps had fallen back to the western wall of the Grand Dorsal Chain, funneling themselves into a narrow 2-mile-wide gap in the mountains known as the Kasserine Pass. This geological choke point was the last natural barrier protecting the Allied supply depots in Algeria, and it became the stage for the most shameful episode in the history of the United States Army in World War II. The weather had turned against the defenders. A cold, driving rain turned the valley floor into a quagmire of mud and misery, matching the plummeting morale of the troops, who were cold, hungry, and terrified. They dug in along the valley walls, a motley collection of engineers, artillerymen, and the survivors of the Sidi Bouzid massacre, waiting for the inevitable hammer blow. It came in the form of the 10th Panzer Division and the elite Afrika Korps Assault Infantry, personally directed by Field Marshal Rommel, who sensed that one final push would shatter the American will completely. As the German tanks probed the minefields and the infantry swarmed up the rocky slopes under the cover of Nebelwerfer rocket fire, the terrifying screaming Mimis, the American defensive line, brittle from days of defeat and lacking any coherent leadership, simply snapped. What followed was not a withdrawal, but a rout of biblical proportions, later euphemistically termed the Kasserine Flush. The discipline of the Second Corps evaporated. Panic, a contagion more lethal than typhus, swept through the ranks. Soldiers threw down their M1 Garand rifles and abandoned their machine gun positions, fleeing westward in a chaotic stampede. The roads leading away from the pass became a choked artery of shame, clogged with bumper-to-bumper traffic consisting of trucks, half-tracks, and commandeered civilian vehicles, all desperate to outrun the panzers. High above, the Junkers Ju-87 Stuka dive bombers of the Luftwaffe circled like vultures, their sirens screaming as they dove on the immobilized columns, turning the retreat into a highway of death. Men cowered in roadside ditches as their vehicles exploded, the burning wreckage blocking the path for those behind, adding to the claustrophobic terror. Officers tore the rank insignia from their collars to avoid capture, and military police at checkpoints were forced to draw their pistols to stop hysterical drivers from fleeing all the way to Iran. It was an army in total collapse, a mob of individuals whose faith in their leaders and themselves had been utterly extinguished by the violence of the enemy. While the front line dissolved into anarchy, the man responsible for the disaster, Major General Lloyd Frendendahl, remained physically and mentally entombed in his command post nearly 100 miles away. His headquarters, located in a ravine he named Speedy Valley near Tebessa, was a monument to his paranoia and incompetence. While his men lacked adequate foxholes and anti-tank mines at the front, Frendendahl had diverted an entire company of engineers to blast a massive bunker complex out of the rock for his own safety, complete with air conditioning and heavy steel doors. Inside this concrete womb, isolated from the mud and the blood, Frendendahl moved pins on a map that was hopelessly outdated, issuing orders that were impossible to execute to units that no longer existed. He bypassed the chain of command, calling battalion commanders directly to give micromanaged instructions about positioning individual machine guns, ignoring the desperate pleas of his division commanders for reinforcements or permission to counterattack. He was a general fighting a phantom war in his head, while the real war was destroying his corps. When reports of the breakthrough at Kasserine reached him, his reaction was one of detached confusion. He blamed the poor fighting quality of the troops rather than his own catastrophic disposition of forces. He had effectively decapitated the Second Corps, leaving the body to thrash blindly while the head hid in a hole. On February 20th, Rommel drove through the captured pass, standing in his command car, his face wrapped in a scarf against the dust, surveying the spoils of his victory. The valley floor was a junkyard of American affluence. He passed abandoned Sherman tanks with their engines still running, artillery pieces with their breeches intact, and mountains of supply crates stacked high. The Germans, accustomed to the austere rations of the Wehrmacht, were stunned by the sheer material wealth of the enemy they had just routed. They cracked open crates to find fresh white bread, canned peaches, cigarettes, chocolate, and even mail from home that had not yet been distributed. Rommel picked up a piece of equipment, examining the high quality of the manufacturing, and felt a mix of contempt and foreboding. He realized that the Americans were militarily incompetent, amateurs who lacked the killer instinct and the tactical finesse of the British or the Russians, but he also saw that they were incredibly rich. They had abandoned more equipment in one afternoon than his entire army possessed. In his report to Berlin, Rommel was scathing. "The Americans are not soldiers yet," he wrote, dismissing them as a mob that broke under pressure. He believed that with one more hard push, he could knock the United States out of the war in Africa. But as he stood amidst the burning wreckage of the U.S. Second Corps, laughing at the ease of his triumph, he missed the subtle shift in the wind. The Kasserine flush was the rock bottom, the moment of absolute humiliation that was necessary to shatter the American arrogance. The United States Army was humiliated, stripped naked before the world, and beaten into the mud. But unlike the French in 1940, they did not surrender. They were angry. The shame of Kasserine was curdling into a cold, hard resolve. The amateurs had failed the test, but the school was not closed. The faculty was about to change, and the new headmaster was packing his ivory-handled revolvers, ready to turn the Speedy Valley bunker into a memory and the terrified mob into army of killers. The stench of burning rubber and scorched duralumin still hung over the Kasserine Pass when General Dwight D. Eisenhower, the supreme Allied commander, finally realized that the catastrophe in Tunisia was not a failure of American bravery, but a terminal cancer of American leadership that required a surgical and merciless extraction. Eisenhower's personal observers, including General Ernest Harmon and the future legend Omar Bradley, returned from the front with harrowing reports of a corps that was physically shattered and psychologically broken, described as a disorganized mob that had lost its soul because its commander, Lloyd Frendendahl, had hidden in a hole while his men died in the sun. The decision was swift. Frendendahl was relieved of command, sent back to the States under the guise of training duties, and on March 6, 1943, a new force of nature descended upon the Tunisian desert to resurrect the ghost of the Second Corps. Major General George S. Patton, Jr. did not simply arrive at the headquarters, he erupted into it in a cloud of dust and the roar of a siren-equipped jeep, a towering figure in polished high-top boots, wearing a lacquered helmet and his signature ivory-handled Colt .45 revolvers strapped to his hips. To the demoralized staff officers who had grown accustomed to Fredendall's subterranean lethargy, Patton was a terrifying apparition from a more violent century, a man who believed in the reincarnation of warriors and the absolute divinity of the offensive. His first act was not to review the maps, but to shatter the culture of defeat through a regime of spit and polish that the exhausted GIs initially found absurd, if not sadistic. Patton issued a series of general orders that became legendary for their perceived pettiness. Every soldier, from the cooks to the frontline rifleman, was required to wear a necktie, a steel helmet at all times, and buckled leggings, even in the blistering heat of the desert. He established a system of heavy fines for anyone caught out of uniform, and he personally patrolled the camps in his command car, looking for unsoldierly behavior. The men grumbled and cursed him, calling him old blood and guts, the joke being his guts, our blood. But Patton was playing a deeper psychological game. He knew that an army that does not take pride in its appearance will not take pride in its fighting, and that the first step to restoring discipline in a rout is to reestablish control over the smallest details of a soldier's life. He moved the headquarters out of the Speedy Valley bunker and into the open air, closer to the front, forcing his staff to live under the same threat of Luftwaffe strafing as the infantry. Simultaneously, Patton transformed the training regimen into a brutal rehearsal for murder. He despised the defensive mindset that had led to the penny packet disasters, and he hammered home a single violent philosophy: we will not just hold, we will attack until we have exhausted the enemy or ourselves. He gathered his troops and delivered profane, electrifying speeches that stripped away the romanticism of the innocents abroad and replaced it with a cold, professional hatred. He told them that the Germans were not monsters to be feared, but targets to be destroyed, and that the secret to winning a war was not to die for your country, but to make the other poor dumb bastard die for his. He emphasized the massing of artillery, the king of battle, and the coordination of tanks and infantry into a single unstoppable machine, a doctrine that had been ignored under Fredendall but was now the law of the land. Every hour was dedicated to live fire exercises, forced marches, and the aggressive cleaning of weapons, turning the camps into hives of kinetic energy. Patton fired officers who showed the slightest hesitation and promoted those who displayed the offensive spirit, creating a leadership cadre that feared his wrath more than they feared the German 88mm guns. By the middle of March, a strange and miraculous transformation had occurred in the Tunisian dust. The men of the Second Corps were still tired, and they still hated the heat, but they no longer looked at their boots when they walked. They moved with a crisp, predatory snap. Their vehicles were clean, their radios were encrypted, and their eyes were fixed on the eastern horizon. The Green Hornets had been burned away, and in their place was a hard, disciplined legion that was no longer interested in surviving the war, but in winning it. Patton had taken a defeated mob and, through the sheer friction of his personality, polished them into a weapon. As reports reached the German lines of a new American commander who rode in a tank and demanded his men wear neckties in the sand, Rommel's successors laughed at the American dandy and his superficial changes, failing to realize that the neckties were merely the silk wrapping on a razor-sharp blade. The graduation ceremony for the new Second Corps was about to begin at a place called El Guitar, and this time, when the Panzers arrived to collect their easy victory, they would find that the amateurs had been replaced by professionals who were eager to show the Desert Fox exactly how much blood and guts it took to hold a piece of earth. Patton had tied the knot of discipline. Now he was ready to pull the trigger. The final bloody exam for the reconstructed U.S. II Corps took place in the late March chill of 1943, within the shadows of the jagged limestone ridges surrounding the El Guitar Valley, a place that would either witness the ultimate redemption of the American soldier or serve as his final dusty grave. General George S. Patton had spent 3 weeks scouring the cowardice from his ranks, And now, as his men looked down from the high ground of the Jebel Burda onto the narrow S-curve of the road leading to the coast, they were no longer a collection of frightened individuals, but a single coiled spring of military violence. Facing them was the 10th Panzer Division, one of the finest armored formations in the Wehrmacht, veterans who had spearheaded the breakthrough at Kasserine and who moved into the valley with a sense of bored arrogance, fully expecting another Kasserine flush, where the Americans would abandon their guns and flee at the first sight of a panzer. At 0600 hours on March 23rd, the valley floor began to vibrate as 50 German tanks, supported by a phalanx of armored half-tracks and the screaming sirens of Stuka dive bombers, rumbled toward the American lines. The German commanders, observing from their hatches, saw the Americans sitting in their foxholes and expected the familiar scene of panic. But as the panzers crossed the 3,000-yard mark, the world suddenly exploded into a wall of steel and fire that the Germans had never encountered before. This was the king of battle, Patton's massed artillery, organized with a mathematical precision that turned the valley floor into a pre-registered slaughterhouse. Under the command of Brigadier General S. Leroy Irwin, the two-corps artillery had been transformed into a unified choir of destruction, with over 100 guns, from 105mm howitzers to heavy 155mm long toms, firing in synchronized volleys. Unlike the sporadic, uncoordinated fire at Kasserine, the shells now fell in time-on-target concentrations, where the rounds from multiple batteries arrived at the same GPS-like coordinates at the exact same second, saturating the German formation in a vertical deluge of high explosives. The German panzer grenadiers, caught in the open, were shredded by the shrapnel, and the tanks were shrouded in such a dense cloud of dust and smoke that they could no longer see their targets. In the foxholes above, the American infantrymen did something that would have been unthinkable a month prior. They stayed put. As the lead panzers rumbled past their positions, the GIs did not run. Instead, they allowed the tanks to pass, then rose up to engage the following German infantry with a disciplined ferocity, separating the tanks from their support. Meanwhile, the M10 tank destroyers of the 601st Battalion, now properly integrated into the defense, played a deadly game of hide-and-seek among the wadis, using their high-velocity 3-inch guns to punch through the side armor of the German Mark IVs. The battle was a savage 6-hour demonstration of combined arms efficiency. The Americans used their radios not to plead for help, but to call down fire with the cold-blooded accuracy of professional executioners. By noon, the invincible 10th Panzer Division was in full retreat, leaving behind 30 blackened, smoldering hulks on the valley floor, their crews dead or captured. A second German attack in the afternoon, supported by infantry from the Centauro Division, was met with the same wall of lead and was broken before it even reached the American perimeter. General Hans-Jürgen von Arnim, the commander of the German forces, was stunned by the reports filtering back to his headquarters. He could not believe that this was the same army he had chased through the Kasserine Pass only weeks before. He sent a frantic message to his superiors, stating that the Americans had achieved a level of defensive tenacity and artillery coordination that was previously thought impossible for them. This was the graduation ceremony that Patton had envisioned. The amateurs had held their ground against the elite of the Afrika Korps and had won a decisive stand-up fight. As Patton stood on a ridge overlooking the battlefield, his ivory-handled revolvers glinting in the desert sun, he felt a grim sense of satisfaction. He had not just won a battle, he had won the soul of an army. The shame of Kasserine had been washed away by the blood of El Ghoutar, and the United States Army had finally earned its seat at the table of the great powers. The German officers who had laughed at the American neckties and amateurism were now either dead or in prisoner of war camps, realizing too late that the Desert Fox had taught the Americans too well. The tuition had been expensive, thousands of lives lost, and a national humiliation, but the Americans were now the masters of the school. They had learned to mask their fire, to trust their equipment, and to hate their enemy with a professional's focus. The war in North Africa would soon end with the total surrender of the Axis forces, but the legacy of El Ghoutar was the creation of a combat-ready force that would eventually storm the beaches of Normandy and break the heart of the Third Reich. The Green Hornets were gone, and in their place stood the American GI, a soldier who had survived the humiliation of defeat to become the architect of victory, proving that while Rommel may have laughed first, it was the amateur Americans who, led by a man of blood and guts, would have the final, terrifying laugh in the ruins of Berlin.